All right. Hey everybody, welcome to MyHR Live today. This topic has already generated a lot of interest online, so thank you for that. We really appreciate the comments and the engagement. We tend to tackle pretty tricky topics. It's something that we think is important. These are the things that need to be discussed. They are part of the landscape of New Zealand employment, and we're happy to dive in and tackle them. We don't claim to know all the answers, which is why we do these things, because we want involvement from our community. So hey, thanks for that, do appreciate it. As always with our live events, we will take questions through the event. I'll try to respond to them all at the end if I can. If we can't get to them all, we will follow up afterwards. And of course, the event is recorded. It's then posted on our YouTube channel, LinkedIn, Facebook, website for you to look at later. And if you post us questions afterwards, we will also do our best to get back to you. So, yeah, thanks again. Look, let's dive into it and we'll see how we go. I've made a lot of notes today. As you know, if you've watched previous lives from me, I will often just riff as I go, but this topic I think is so important and so sensitive that I really wanted to make sure that we had things well covered. So look forward to you jumping in with your views and your questions. So workplace bullying, that's the topic for today. Firstly, I'd like to be clear on some definitions, and I'd like to be clear on what is and is not bullying. And that's not to kind of drown this whole topic in legal semantics around definitions, etc. It's also not to diminish the things that are not bullying. It's simply that this is a massive topic, and all forms of, I guess, bad behavior in the workplace, victimization, harassment, bullying, that sort of thing, have serious consequences. Today's topic is about bullying, and we simply don't have the time to dive into every other tangent. Happy to pick it up later if that's what you'd like us to do. So what is not workplace bullying? What workplace bullying is not. How do I say that? I've gone straight to WorkSafe for this because they've got a great definition, a great way of defining what is workplace bullying and what is not. So I'm just going to read this. Workplace bullying is not one-off or occasional instances of forgetfulness, rudeness, or tactlessness, setting high performance standards, constructive feedback and legitimate advice or peer review, a manager requiring reasonable verbal or written work instructions to be carried out, warning or disciplining workers in line with the business rules, a single incident of unreasonable behaviour, reasonable management actions delivered in a reasonable way, and differences in opinion or personality clashes that do not escalate. All right. All I'll say is two things quickly about this list. So the first thing is when we talk about these one-off instances of dickish behaviour, you know, someone's clearly had a bad day or they've gotten angry, they've done something, call it out. That's my advice to you, employers and employees. Often it's not intended to harm. Someone has clearly got other things going on. They snap, they do something, it's inappropriate. Call it out then and there, don't sit on it. And hopefully the person acknowledges it, is remorseful, apologises, and everyone can get on with life and it doesn't escalate and become a major problem, right? So if you see it, it's incumbent on all of us to call that kind of thing out. Second thing, as a business owner or manager, when you're running a disciplinary process, make sure you do it properly. And that mitigates the risk of it being called bullying. You know, you have a fair process. You have a genuine substantive justification that you can back up with evidence. So we've done heaps of stuff around disciplinary. Have a look at it and get some support and advice around it, because a well-run and proper disciplinary process cannot get confused for bullying. They are two quite different things. So that's what it's not. So let's dive into why it's important that we know what it is and why we should even care about this thing, right? Well, firstly, New Zealand's got a pretty lousy track record. Looking at the WorkSafe website, from their surveys, they say that 1 in 5 people report having been bullied or harassed at work. I think in another survey I read, that puts us, we're like second in the OECD or something for workplace bullying or instances of. So it's not that great. It's also covered by multiple laws, notably the Health and Safety at Work Act. Penalties under that legislation, as you know, can be prison time and significant fines. It's covered by the Human Rights Act, the Crimes Act, the Harmful Digital Communications Act, and it's covered by the Employment Relations Act. And claims under the Employment Relations Act can be disadvantage, it can be unfair dismissal, constructive dismissal, all of which also come with financial penalties, grievance action, and also, of course, the time taken to handle the grievance and follow it through. A major drain on your business. In addition to these formal and legal consequences, bullying unchecked will affect productivity, no doubt. People just won't work as hard. There'll be higher instances of sick leave, there will be higher staff turnover. It will affect your ability to hire good people as the word gets out, right? We're a small town in New Zealand. People know people, and word gets out pretty quickly. If you're not a good employer, people aren't going to want to come and work for you. And it can undermine your ability to engage in genuine performance management. When you have a genuine issue, if you haven't dealt with a culture of bullying or issues with particular managers in relation to bullying, when a genuine problem arises, it becomes very difficult to tackle that because it's caught up in the cloud of all of this bad management behaviour. So these things have real commercial impacts. There's a genuine reason for it. And if all that aside, there's just the moral question. Right? What sort of human do you want to be? What sort of workplace do you want? Do you want to have a working community where this kind of behaviour is acceptable? So that's why it's important. It's why we think it's important. It's why the law thinks it's important. And New Zealand's not alone in this. As you probably know from my previous chats, I've spent a bit of time working in Australia as well. In Victoria, they have a law called Brodie's Law. And it places a penalty of up to 10 years in prison where workplace bullying has been proven. I think it falls under the Victorian Crimes Act or something like that. And this was in relation to a bullying incident in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, where a young girl committed suicide after repeated workplace bullying that went unchecked and unmanaged by a group of people. So an awful and tragic outcome. So this stuff is serious and it needs to be taken seriously. So what is it? Once again, I'm going to quote from WorkSafe simply because they have a great and succinct definition. So I'm going to do some reading again. Workplace bullying is repeated and unreasonable behaviour directed towards a worker or group of workers that can lead to physical or psychological harm. So a couple of key words there. One is repeated, right? It is persistent. It occurs more than once. And it's not the same thing occurring more than once, right? It can be different types of bad behaviour towards an individual, but it is targeted and repeated at that individual or a group of people. Unreasonable. Now this may sound a little more subjective, but it is a hallmark of all of our employment legislation, and defining unreasonable is simply it are actions that a reasonable person in the same circumstances would see as unreasonable. This includes victimising, humiliating, intimidating or threatening a person. Bullying may also include harassment, discrimination or violence. Right? So it's pretty clearly defined in our legislation and by the authorities that look after workplace safety and workplace conduct. Bullying isn't limited to managers targeting staff. It can be between workers, it can be between a group of people targeting an individual or individuals targeting a group of people or a certain collective. It can be carried out by customers or clients towards employees or back the other way. And it can take place outside of work. There's a case, and it didn't relate, I think it was a harassment case, not a bullying case, but it has parallels. And from memory, it was a Wellington postal worker, I think. It's a few years ago now, but it's worth having a look at. And it was a harassment issue that occurred outside of work. It related to some nasty text messages and things that were sent. And a claim was raised that wasn't dealt with appropriately. It went all the way through the courts. And there was a really important quote from the judge. And I'm nervous about quoting judges and being recorded doing so where I don't know the quote, but it was something along the lines of where the behaviour has its genesis in the workplace. It is the employer has a direct responsibility to deal with it, if you like. So even though in this case the harassment had occurred outside of work, the relationship between the two people was a work relationship, and the issue that they were engaged in or that the harassment was taking place over was a work-related issue. And the judge expanded then the ruling and said, well, no, you as an employer have to deal with it. You can't just say it happened on text message outside of work, hands off. So be aware of that. Social media particularly opens up the prevalence of this sort of thing. So here are some examples of what it can look like. Things like setting impossible targets, right? It's not always your kind of typical schoolyard bully, standover tactics, physical or verbal abuse, although it is those things. But it can also be setting targets that a person simply cannot achieve and then regularly pushing them hard and berating them for not doing that. Be making decisions that significantly affect a person without any consultation. So stuff that regularly sort of upsets or disrupts their work, changes in meeting times without notifying them or giving them enough notice so they miss things, and then you're constantly berating them or belittling them for not meeting those targets. It might be inconsistent, so the expectations you place on that individual are not reflected across anybody else. It can be withdrawal of cooperation or support or communication, so failing to talk to people or communicate with them. Obviously, it is things like insults. It can be physical, verbal abuse as well. So all of these things constitute examples of what bullying might be. Right, so there's the descriptions and definitions piece. Next, what I'd like to do is jump into what can you do about it. Our role is to support employers to handle workplace issues properly and effectively. And these rules, to be clear, apply to all employers in New Zealand, right? We don't have a tiered legislation system. So sometimes with things like bullying, when we talk about codes of conduct and policies, small employers might argue that, well, that's a very corporate approach. We can't do this. We don't have capacity for policies. Just be aware that the law doesn't exclude you, all right? The same law that applies to employers of 5 people apply to the largest corporates in the country. So you do have to do something about this, and you have to figure out a way that you can do it within your context. What I would argue, if you're a small employer, is you're in many ways much better placed to deal with it because you know your people so much better. You know, the corporates are so big, and there are so many layers of management and so many teams within teams within teams that often policies and codes of conduct can kind of just get caught up in the wash. You have the opportunity to engage immediately and directly with all of your staff. That is the beauty of a small employer. You can act quickly and you can get stuff done. So, you know, use that and leverage it. So what do you do about it? Planning and prep is the first step. You need to have, and I would encourage you to have this as part of your health and safety policy and health and safety plan, right? Since the Health and Safety and Employment Act was replaced by the Health and Safety at Work Act, all employers had to update their employment agreements, so I'm hoping you've all done that, and that you have a clear and focused policy around how you deal with health and safety risks, hazards, issues, incidents, accidents, near misses, notifiable incidents, etc. in the workplace. Caught up in that and picked up in that should be something that allows you and makes it clear to your employees how you will deal with bullying. So be clear on behaviour expectations of your people. The escalation process. If you are an employee or a manager and you feel like you're being bullied, what do you do? Now again, I acknowledge in a small workplace this can be difficult. The alleged bully might be best mates with the business owner, or it might be the business owner themselves. If employees don't feel they can go to someone within the business, they can go externally. They have a right to involve somebody if they have a genuine bullying claim. So this could be a union, they could call the Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment, Citizens Advice, could be an advocate, a lawyer, a representative, that sort of person. So immediately you'll have an external party involved in a workplace matter. So just be mindful that if you don't have good processes internally, people are allowed to look externally for that sort of help. So make the behaviour expectations clear so people know how they should behave in the workplace and know what you will and won't tolerate and will and do and don't expect from your people. Manage to these standards, right? So if you talk about it, you put it in writing, then make sure you follow up if that kind of behaviour is found out or something like that happens. Hire people that display those qualities. You know, often business owners sort of get to a stage and they might think, well, we're growing, we're bigger, we've gone from 10, maybe 20, we're now at sort of 30 people and I need my ops manager and they're my kind of head knocker. You know, they're going to get in there and get stuff done and run the operation. And it's, you know, that language around I'm firm but fair and all of these sorts of things sometimes gets a bit old school and a bit tired. Just be really clear that being firm but fair is okay and setting strict targets is okay, but there's a limit. You know, there are strict targets and there are unreasonable and unfair targets. There's firm but fair, and then there's just actually being over the top and aggressive in your management style. So be really careful about that and recruit to your standards. So if you have a system in place and if something arises, then you've got something that you can fall back on, right, and react to. Equally, then, if you need to undertake a genuine performance management process, it's really clear what is and what isn't bullying. I go back to my earlier point. So that's the first step. Do some work now to prep for this. Wrap it into your health and safety policy and processes in the business. So what do you do if a complaint is raised? Again, WorkSafe has some great tools, and I've drawn on a few of them. I'd encourage you, if you get caught out or if you're confused or you're not sure, to have a look at their website, or of course give us a call. The first thing though, when a complaint is raised, is treat all matters seriously. Don't dismiss them just because you've decided that they're not true. And sometimes this can be hard, and I guess I'm going to address a bit of an elephant in the room, and that is that sometimes the person who raises the allegation is not that popular. And I've dealt with this in a previous role, long enough ago that we can talk about it without disclosing any details, but it was an employee who just wasn't very popular among their co-workers, and at one point they had dobbed in one of their co-workers. They'd told on them about something, and that person had got in trouble, and the kind of collective group of workers really treated this person quite badly. And when the allegation was raised and they felt that they'd been bullied, the general kind of mood in the workplace was, well, almost as if they deserved it, which is a terrible situation to be in and awful for that person. So popularity does not determine whether or not someone has or has not been bullied. So be very careful about that. An accusation of bullying might arise during a disciplinary process. So we've established that genuine disciplinary is not an example of bullying, but just because an allegation is raised during disciplinary doesn't mean you could therefore dismiss it outright, you see. So be clear that when a bullying allegation is raised, you do take it seriously and you take a look at it, and make sure that if you are going to park it or dismiss it, that you have genuine grounds to do that. Act promptly. Act promptly. It's too easy to let things like this lie because they can be incredibly difficult and quite sensitive. And so often people might take the allegation and sit with it and wonder what they're going to do about it, or how do I talk to this person about it. Workplace, again, has this awesome form. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that you over kind of create more forms in your business than you need, but there are some key questions on this that you can ask of a person who believes they've been bullied, because if they can answer these questions clearly, you may have a case to investigate. So when did it happen? Where did it occur? Who was present? What was said and who said what? Why do you think it is bullying? It is unreasonable because ... It is repeated because. It's endangered my health and safety because. Who witnessed this incident? How did this incident make you feel? How has this incident affected your work? Have you taken any actions? If so, what? As a result of the complaint, what do you want to happen? So, pretty clear, and these are the sorts of questions that will help you really draw out whether someone has just decided to have a crack or whether they've got a genuine claim. In my experience, not many people raise a bullying complaint just because they feel like having a crack, right? And I can hear a bunch of employers out there going, oh, no, but this is... The stats on this fall far on the side of bullying behaviour occurring and not being dealt with than the other way, and that's a simple fact, I'm sorry to say. Ensure there's no victimisation. So if you've established that there is a complaint or something to be answered, then both parties need to be protected at this stage, right? So there can't be repercussions for the person raising the allegation, but equally for the person who has been accused. You can't, or they can't or should not be victimised, and that all parties should be protected by victimisation. If you determine that action needs to take place, that action will be the consequence of the bullying, not some sort of form of mob behaviour, victimisation, targeting, that kind of thing. So support all parties. Once you undertake an investigation, both parties are entitled to support people and representatives. Be neutral, and ideally have any investigation completed by an impartial investigator. And by that I don't mean an external consultant that you pay lots and lots of money to come in, but somebody who's not directly associated with them. Again, in a small business, I acknowledge this can be hard, but if you're not the person who's been accused or the accuser and you have a position of seniority, you might be the person ideally placed to investigate that claim. Communicate the process and outcome so people are clear what's happening, when will it happen, and what will be the outcome of this, and maintain privacy outside the investigation. So, and this will get into then the process of dealing with it. Privacy relates to the privacy of the individuals in the investigation, to the outside world, right? You cannot go out and talk to this with the workplace more broadly. Oh yeah, Bill's been accused of bullying, or Mary's done this, or whatever it may be. Within the context of the investigation, the parties have the right to know what is being discussed. So, and this gets into the issue of anonymous complaints, which is what I'll deal with now before we wrap and go to questions. So, WorkSafe talks about informal and formal dealings of bullying allegations. So if you've gone through these steps I've just described, dealing with an allegation informally might be justified if you simply haven't been able to establish whether or not bullying has taken place, but there seems to be something going on. Or if a complaint was anonymous and you've been unable to determine who made it, or the person who made it is unwilling to acknowledge that they've made it, and you don't necessarily know that they have. Or if the complaint has been made by another person who witnessed it, but the person who was allegedly being bullied claims that they weren't, and you sort of have this unusual situation where the complaint is raised by somebody who wasn't involved, but the person who was involved is very clear when you go and speak to them that they weren't bullied. Yet, nevertheless, you have what appear to be some fairly serious allegations. So an informal outcome may be that you then just remind the manager or the other employee who was involved and who was at the end of the allegation of bullying what your standards and expectations are, remind them what they need to do, how they're expected to behave. Simply because you may not have justification for any formal disciplinary action, and that disciplinary action may simply be unwarranted. Where you have enough evidence to conduct a formal disciplinary process and disciplinary outcomes, then there is full disclosure. So the person who is being accused of bullying is entitled to receive the details of the complaint and the details of the person who made the complaint. And this is part of the natural justice process that's associated with these disciplinary matters. Any further investigations and witness statements equally need to be shared with the person who is the subject of the bullying allegation. And that protects them from complaints that are potentially false. It allows them to give a full and honest response as they're entitled to do. So if you go through that process and you determine that bullying has occurred and therefore disciplinary action is justified, the next step is to determine what you do. In many cases, this may and can well be regarded as serious misconduct. It will result therefore in summary dismissal, so that's termination of employment without notice. If you determine it's not a dismissible offence and someone receives a warning and that's followed by a performance improvement plan, you will need to make really certain that when they come back to the workplace that the people who made the allegations are protected. And equally that the bully or the alleged, well, I guess they're a bully at that point, they've been determined that they have the ability to genuinely improve. It can be quite a difficult situation, as you can imagine, if the allegation has been upheld and the person comes back into work. So that's how you might manage it through formal disciplinary process. Finally, what I'll say is after all of this has happened, follow up. Right? Make sure that there is some kind of follow-up, that people are okay, and whether that could be a formal offer of counselling or it might just be a check-in. Some of the things that can help with this are just pulse surveys. They're not quite the full old corporate engagement surveys, but just a quiet, one question pulse survey of your people from time to time to just gauge the pulse of the organisation. Look at some of the data around your organisation. Do you have high staff turnover, high instances of sick leave, that kind of thing. Keep an eye on it. Keep an eye on the mood of the business, and particularly post-incident, make sure you follow up and don't just ignore it. As I said, WorkSafe has some great tools online. We can also help. That's part of what we're here to do. We are all responsible for calling out workplace bullying. Employers, employees, customers, if you're in a business and you see it taking place. It's one of those sort of societal responsibilities we have, and hopefully we can reduce the instances of it in New Zealand and improve our record. So that's it from the formal stuff. I'm going to see if there are any questions. There's a couple. Here we go. Let me just have a look. Oh yeah, okay. So Susan, Susan's asked us, sorry to do that, I'm just sort of leaning and reading the question, about engaging Culture Safe New Zealand Limited for advice. By all means, totally. They are a good body and go for it. We don't have anything against them. I've gone to WorkSafe principally because they have a lot of tools. It's very well defined, and of course it's defined in legislation, so it presents some genuine legal risk for the business. And it looks like a couple of the others have been answered online by my team, which is pretty cool. So that means I don't need to answer them live. But look, like I say, any other questions, anything that comes up after this event or anything you see in the recording that you would like clarity on, please post a question. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. Thanks again for tuning in. It's been great to do another Facebook Live. You'll probably have Sylvie again next time. We'll try to alternate them now. But yeah, all the best. Thank you.